Imagine this. You're living on the island of Crete, somewhere around 1600 BCE. Your neighbors are building sprawling palaces decorated with dolphins, lilies, and acrobats flipping over bulls. There are no fortress walls, no armies parading in the streets, no sense that war is a daily threat. You trade olive oil, wine, and crafted goods across the Mediterranean, and life feels stable. But within just a few decades, this world disappears. Not because the Minoans forgot how to farm, or because they ran out of paint for their frescoes, but because forces outside their control and across the sea were closing in. Here's the thing. For years, the story has been told like this. The Minoans were wiped out by a volcanic eruption, a natural disaster so cataclysmic that their culture just vanished. That's neat, clean, and easy. Except it's not quite true. Because when you zoom out, you see another story running alongside. A rising warrior society on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans, who didn't just inherit the Minoans' world, but actively reshaped it. And once you realize that, the story of how one civilization conquered another starts to look less like an accident of geology and more like a calculated takeover. So, let's back up. Who were the Minoans? These were the people of Crete, an island that sat like a massive aircraft carrier in the middle of the Aegean Sea. From about 2000 BCE onward, they built palaces like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, sprawling complexes with multiple stories, drainage systems, and courtyards for ritual games. Their art was bright and naturalistic. Dolphins, flowers, women in flowing dresses. Everything about it feels almost utopian. What's striking is what's missing. No fortress walls. No clear evidence of mass armies. For centuries, historians have suggested that the Minoans were a kind of peaceful thalassocracy, a maritime empire that ruled through trade, not conquest. But look closer. That's not the whole story. Because across the sea, on the Greek mainland, a very different kind of society was emerging. The Mycenaeans. And they weren't painting dolphins. They were stockpiling weapons, training chariot warriors, and fortifying citadels on hilltops. Mycenae, Tyrans, Pylos. These were stone fortresses, each with a king, or wanax, ruling from a megaron, a grand throne room with a hearth blazing in the middle. If the Minoans were the architects of beauty, the Mycenaeans were the architects of war. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Mycenaeans weren't just random warlords. They borrowed heavily from the Minoans. Their writing system, Linear B, is literally an adaptation of the Minoans' Linear A. Their religious symbols, double axes, bull iconography, show up on the mainland. Their frescoes, Minoan in style, except instead of dolphins, you see warriors, shields, and hunting scenes. This wasn't just cultural borrowing. It was cultural takeover, one brushstroke at a time. But the real turning point came with disaster. Around 1600 BCE, the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted in one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history. Entire towns were buried in ash. Tsunamis swept into Crete. Earthquakes rattled the palaces. For a society with no standing armies, no fortress walls, and no military aristocracy, this was devastating. Their trade networks fractured, their palaces were damaged, and into that chaos sailed the Mycenaeans. Archaeology backs this up. By 1450 BCE, almost every major Minoan palace outside Knossos was destroyed. The ruins show fire, weapons, and abrupt abandonment. Meanwhile, Linear B tablets, unmistakably Mycenaean, begin appearing at Knossos itself. In other words, the Mycenaeans didn't just loot Crete, they moved in. Knossos becomes a Mycenaean administrative center, run by mainlanders who had absorbed Minoan systems, but placed them under their own military hierarchy. Now, was it a hostile invasion or just opportunistic migration? That's still debated. Some evidence, Mycenaean swords found in Cretan ruins, suggests violence. Other evidence, DNA studies showing mixing of mainland and island populations, points to something more gradual, like elites marrying into local families while taking power. But either way, by the 14th century BCE, the writing is clear. Crete is Mycenaean. Here's the irony. The Mycenaeans defined themselves against the Minoans. They were more militarized, more hierarchical, more fortress-minded. But they also depended on Minoan systems. Without Minoan trade routes, there would be no Mycenaean expansion. Without Minoan writing, no Linear B. Without Minoan imagery, no Mycenaean frescoes. It's a takeover that looks less like replacement and more like repackaging. A civilization that says, we'll take your plumbing and your art, thanks, but we'll add swords, shields, and kings. And this hybrid culture becomes the foundation of the Greece we think we know. Homer's epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, are about Mycenaean kings and warriors, Agamemnon at Mycenae, Nestor at Pylos, Odysseus at Ithaca. These are the descendants of that warlike culture. But look carefully at the background of those epics, the palaces, the rituals, the gods, and you still see Minoan DNA. What's fascinating is that even the timeline isn't settled. For decades, scholars tied the Thera eruption directly to the Minoans' collapse. But newer geological studies suggest the eruption happened earlier than the palace destructions, maybe a century earlier, which means the eruption alone didn't kill Minoan society. Something else had to happen, and the most obvious candidate is Mycenaean aggression. But here's where the map complicates things. Crete didn't just fall once. Palaces collapsed, were rebuilt, collapsed again. Sometimes the evidence looks like earthquake damage, other times like burning and looting, which suggests a slow-motion conquest, a society weakened by nature, then chipped away by neighbors who smelled blood. So what's the takeaway? Civilizations don't just vanish, they get absorbed, repackaged, rewritten. The Minoans didn't vanish into thin air. They became part of the Mycenaean world, and the Mycenaeans, in turn, became the Greeks we know. When you stand in the ruins of Knossos today, you're looking at two civilizations layered on top of each other, one literally painted over the other, and that's the hidden truth. The fall of the Minoans wasn't just nature's wrath, it was also human ambition. Volcanoes may have shaken the island, but warriors from across the sea finished the job. So, was this a conquest? Or was it a merger, a hostile takeover that left just enough of the old brand intact to carry forward? That's for you to decide. Because here's the part everyone misses. Without this collision, natural disasters colliding with human opportunism, the classical world as we know it might never have existed. No Homer, no epics, no myths of heroes storming Troy. All of that comes from this messy, violent, hybrid moment in history. So the next time someone tells you the Minoans were just wiped out by a volcano, remember, that's only half the story. The other half is written in fire, bronze, and borrowed scripts. And that raises one last question. When civilizations collapse today, from climate change, economic shocks, or wars, are we really watching endings? Or are we watching the beginning of someone else's story?